Can COVID is an open science collective dedicated to rapidly mobilizing and sharing knowledge to help inform Canada's COVID-19 response. To learn more about us or how to join our community, you can visit our website at cancovid.ca.
Thanks, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Hello and welcome back. This is the first session of the 2022 Winter Speaker Series for Can COVID. Happy New Year, everyone. And if you're in the midst of this deep freeze that we're all experiencing here in Ontario, thanks for crawling out from under your duvet and joining us today. So terrific to have you with us for this first session. My name is Susan Law. I'm the Managing Director at Can COVID, and I have the pleasure of introducing you to this week's speaker, Dr. Peter Jüni. He is one of our science advisors for Can COVID and the Scientific Director for the Ontario Science Table. Our title today is Omicron, a portrait of Omicron to date, what we know and the projected consequences. We do have time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers, so please feel free to use the chat box to enter your questions, and we'll get to them following Dr. Jüni's presentation. Over to you, Dr. Jüni. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Susan. Okay, so I actually don't know how long it will be. I try to be relatively brief and just start, if I manage here, just to move slides with, one of the first questions. Just let's review that quickly, because this has actually quite some consequences, perhaps not necessarily anymore for Ontario, but for a lot of other places. And I struggle here to continue because Zoom is always interfering, but we'll find out how this goes. What you see here is the original concern based on South African data when we saw how swiftly Omicron was taking over from Delta. You see this tremendously steep slope downwards. That's basically Delta disappearing, upwards, Omicron appearing on the stage. And it wasn't clear at the beginning whether there was some weird phenomenon going on in terms of some founder effects because of social networks. Within these social networks, Omicron just exploding, but it wouldn't be such a big deal because the step from 10% to 90% happened within roughly 3 weeks. And this couldn't be that you would see something like that, anywhere else. Was, one of the arguments. There must be something off with that. But here we are. That's the situation based on observed data. I stopped tracking here for the PHOL lab relatively early here. That's basically the logistic growth curve, but I continued tracking for the Mount Sinai lab and CCM plus data, as you see here. Observed data really following a logistic growth curve as rapidly as what we have seen actually in South Africa. Within few weeks, 3 weeks or so, we made it to 90%. Now, according to the Mount Sinai lab, that still provides regular data here, we're a bit sub-logistic now. We flatten a little bit, but we're basically now around 95%. And it's important to notice here, look at that. Around mid-December, according to each of the labs, we reached 50% Omicron. And that's how this would look now, just on our dashboard. When you go there, you'll find this is terribly confusing. Always Zoom still continuing to just interfere here. Can you do something just to get rid of that? I'm not sure whether it's possible. I see all these dialog boxes all the time. But anyway, so what you're seeing basically here is the initial slopes of replacement with delta here replacing alpha, and here alpha that was replacing the wild type. And you see that the more we go down in time, the steeper the curve, the logistic growth curve that you see represented here, not modeled, but based on real data, just in real time. That's basically how evolution works. Now we're just down here. We now have a flattening here, about 3-4% or so of cases may still be Delta, but 95 to 96% are indeed Omicron. So what about severity? We're all aware of this statement here by Anthony Fauci, encouraging news. This will be less severe. And we had a challenge, not because this was necessarily wrong, but because it allowed the development of a narrative which said, okay, that's just less severe, and therefore we don't have to care and we can just let it rip. You know, that was basically the narrative that one heard again and again in the news internationally, to a lesser extent here in Canada, luckily. But the caveats we had from the science table from the beginning, of course, was that when one triangulated the situation in Gauteng, the province that has about the same population size as we do, 15.5 million, then one would see that approximately 90% of the population in Gauteng was infected at least once. They had roughly 50,000 deaths from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. In addition to 90% having some sort of immunity through infection, 36% of the population were vaccinated. And it makes a difference, you know, to have a median age of 27 in Gauteng as compared to a median age of 41 here in Ontario, and much higher, you know, in many places in the Western world, with having less than 5% of people above the age of 65. So, you know, this may well have been for Gauteng, but what would it mean for us? This was entirely unclear. Meanwhile, of course, we have considerably more data around, and what we can say relatively confidently now is that probably the risk of hospitalization is reduced to half, perhaps even a bit more, and probably the risk of ICU admission, once you account for vaccination, previous infection, and the regular risk factors, the risk of ICU admission would even be reduced by a factor of 4 to 5. No, so that's what we see here, relative risk of 0.2 for ICU admission, of 0.5 for hospitalization, comparing Omicron with Delta. And this holds most likely for vaccinated as for unvaccinated people, with vaccination not necessarily being an effect modifier for this relative risk. And then if it comes to vaccine effectiveness, we will talk about that later. But we find right now for this combination that we're seeing here of 2 and 3 doses in our province, but we see similar patterns also elsewhere, probably about a 90% effectiveness, so a 10-fold decrease in the risk of ICU admission, which comes on top of what you're seeing just, of course, up here. And about 80% effectiveness, meaning a 5-fold decrease in the risk of hospital admission associated with 2 to 3 doses of a vaccine, with a 3rd dose indeed just affording considerably more protection than only 2 doses. We're not completely able yet to disentangle the 2 and 3 dose effects here. What is now important just to realize once more, if you just have a choice, that's a theoretical curve by Adam Kucharski that I adapted for ICU admissions here. If you have a choice between a variant becoming 50% more severe and the variant becoming 50% more transmissible at the same severity, whereas the 50% more severe one would have the same transmissibility, then of course transmissibility always governs. But this again, you know, gets forgotten when people start to talk about that. If you have something which is 50% more transmissible, your case growth will be the governing factor that will basically lead you to considerably more healthcare use than a variant that is actually 50% more severe. And it's obviously a no-brainer. If you have now a situation where you have 50% less hospital admissions. You only need to wait for one doubling time to have twice as many cases, and you basically have compensated for your decreased risk of hospital admissions. And that's the challenge here that we were facing. Now let's quickly go to Switzerland and have a look at the situation they're in right now. Remember what we said, we reached 50% of Omicron mid-December. So what we are seeing now is the full-blown picture of what other places actually can still expect and what we anticipated. Therefore, I was also, out there with my dog and pony show in December, just to make clear that people understood what would be coming. For example, what you're seeing here is indeed just very recently, a few days ago, the 50% mark crossed, probably around 5th of January or so. And let's look at the infections, unsurprisingly now, based on an already quite impressive Delta wave. Switzerland has a population of 8.7 million. We have 14.7 here in Ontario. They basically make it with a better testing system than we have, to be also clear, currently now to 25,000 cases per day. That's a lot for 8.7 million. But remember, they just made it above 50% with Omicron. So this will continue here to explode quite dramatically. Here is our story. Up to here, we were able to track cases relatively well. This was around Christmas. After that, our testing system was completely overwhelmed and we changed testing strategy. So what you're seeing here is not basically the wave that is being over. It's just us not being able to deal with the case growth anymore, and we're not able to track case counts anymore and don't want to. Obviously, we have changed strategy. Therefore, the case counts become irrelevant. But what is not irrelevant is what you're seeing on this slide. This is the small, now looking, really looking tiny, the small Delta wave we had with this increase here at the beginning, and then around the time when Omicron had a share of perhaps 30 to 40%, what you start to see is a decrease in case counts. Now, remember what we have. If I go back here, you have a strong growth in Omicron, but Omicron is associated with 50% of the risk of hospital admission once you account for vaccination status and previous infection. And you have a Delta variant that is actually associated with an increased risk of hospital admission, which is being replaced by Omicron. So when you're actually in this region here and you start to see a relatively strong decrease in the case count for Delta at that stage here, and you replace a more virulent variant with a less virulent variant, what you will see just here around this time is that paradoxically, hospital admissions could flatten or potentially even go down, and more pronounced, since the risk is even decreased more, ICU admissions could go down too. Let's see whether this indeed happens in Switzerland. That's their hospital admissions right now. This is just the effect of Delta being replaced by Omicron, but the Omicron case counts not exploding enough in those who are not vaccinated and not infected to already make a difference. If we then start to look at occupancy, this before was admissions, you start to see, there starts to be a little uptick here now. And what we're seeing with ICU admissions or ICU occupancy still going down. This is just the effect of replacing Delta with Omicron being less severe, but of course, just completely outnumbering Delta and just resulting in an explosive exponential growth, so that this is just the quiet before the storm, and it's actually absolutely deceiving what we're seeing here. So at that level, look at this once more, just, have a look at that once more. Remember, 8.7 million, they probably detect about 40% of the cases still, at that time here. That's where they are right now, and they don't discuss any restrictions, because what they're seeing here is basically, okay, hospital admissions are still going down, ICU occupancy is still decreasing, we're good. And that's, of course, suicidal. No? That was the situation here in Gauteng. Looking at hospital admissions per day, a 7-day average. And when you just look at that, it's 2 scales here for hospital admissions and for cases per day. Hospital admissions were basically tracking case counts at the lower level, but you see basically the same slope for cases and for hospital admissions. That's our situation here in Ontario now. So after a latency, hospital occupancy starts to explode, as we see here, with a doubling time currently of roughly a week. And this is followed with about 7 days time lag by ICU occupancy. And it looks as if we will achieve a doubling time for ICU occupancy of roughly 7 days very soon, in 2 to 3 days as well. So basically both, as long as you actually could track case numbers, both hospital occupancy and ICU occupancy appear to track at the lower level, but roughly with the same slope, what we have observed for case counts. That's the challenge we're talking about, and that everybody else who is not quite there yet or about to be in the same shoes as we have been now for a few weeks will be talking about very soon. So what can we do to protect ourselves? Obviously, one thing is the vaccine. And what you're seeing here basically is the calculated protection. That's just real time based on an ongoing daily analysis of the data, retrospective cohort study of the vaccinated and unvaccinated, not able to as of yet distinguishing between 2 and 3 vaccine doses. Therefore, what you're seeing here first is basically for protection against infection, the advent of Omicron, a lack of protection or a near lack of protection, against Omicron infection, combined with the effects of vaccine certificates and the general knowledge and behavior of people who are fully vaccinated with 2 doses, believing here still, around this time that they would be protected when they go to a restaurant, even though they were not. And what you basically just see, the protection just decreasing, just like snow under the sun, to next to null, which is also in line with recent data by Jeff Kwong and colleagues, indicating that indeed 2 doses of a vaccine a few months, 2 to 3 months after the second dose will not offer any protection against infection. Why? Omicron is partially evading the immune system, and we simply don't have neutralizing levels of antibodies anymore. That's normal, after 2 to 3 months after the second dose. And what you now see here is probably a combination of the third dose kicking in, plus a change in behavior, plus a third element, which is important too, which is we changed testing strategy, and we now tend to only detect more severe cases, whereas less severe cases actually will not be even tested anymore. And the combination of these phenomena now results in the impression of increased protection against infection again. One part, the booster, is indeed this phenomenon. The second one, behavior of people, as we will see in a moment, is partially probably also just real, whereas the third one, just this change in testing strategy towards testing only people with more severe disease, is just biasing this estimate here a bit upwards. The good news, we're still at roughly 90% protection against ICU admission, and at roughly 80%, somewhat lower right now, will probably go up again. The incidental diagnosis here will result in an underestimate of this effect here a bit, but we will have a continued protection against hospital admission of around 80%, or a 5-fold decrease in the risk of hospital admission as compared to unvaccinated people. So here is the situation here in Ontario regarding out-of-home mobility, which typically is very well correlated with contact rates. It seems as if our population really reacted relatively well to the discussions we had and the challenges we discussed regarding Omicron, and kept their out-of-home mobility really quite low. You know, it's almost comparable to the situation beginning of January here, or is actually comparable. And if this stays like that, this happened even before the public health measures were imposed. If it stays like that together with the public health measures, things probably will improve a little bit relatively soon. We're not sure yet by how much. It depends on whether what we're seeing here is indeed associated with a roughly 50% decrease in high-risk contacts. And high-risk contacts is not, you know, within 2 meters and, 15 minutes exposition to another person. This is basically just being a very short term, for instance, in a restaurant in the neighborhood of somebody else in the same room. So we can forget about the 2 meters, you can forget about the 15 minutes. That's obsolete for Omicron. And of course, the other part, which is really important, is this explosive growth here of people who have received the third dose. And we continue actually to have roughly 1 million third doses per week that we apply to people in the community. Last part, and then I'll stop, rapid testing. This is an early study on analytical sensitivity by Isabel Eckerle. She then provided an additional table that you see here that looked early into people with cultivated infectious virus, and the outcome of rapid tests done early with roughly 50 to 60% sensitivity, depending on the test that you use. That's the PanBio test that we're well aware of here in our province in Ontario. And therefore, a real inability to rule out infectious virus through a rapid test. A complete change of the situation we had before for Delta, and for Alpha, rapid tests actually worked really well originally. That made me, just immediately before New Year's Eve, just work with one of the Toronto Star journalists, Kenyon Wallace, and this story here. It just didn't work anymore. You can't use rapid tests anymore to reliably rule out, if you use nasal swabs at least, early disease and infectiousness, and it wouldn't work, for a calm, quiet, non-infectious New Year's Eve. When you then continue, this was then just published on the 5th of January here, you see this confirmed, more or less. You see just a lot of early false negative tests here, antigen tests in red. That's all nasal swabs. So things might be different if you use a different approach for the specimen collection. We will see that in a moment, but a lot of false negatives early on. And therefore the question, and we don't have all the answers yet, but it makes perfect sense. If we start to use a combination of oral, buccal, and tongue with nasal swab, could we potentially just achieve higher viral concentrations with lower average CT values, and therefore have a higher sensitivity of rapid antigen tests early on? It may be the case, but the books are not closed. Finally, what about monitoring? You remember we're not working anymore with case counts. It's impossible. Is there any alternative that we have an early indicator that is more than just what we're doing now with the lagging indicator of hospital occupancy and then ICU occupancy and then death? The solution for that, of course, could be wastewater. Here, that's the last slide, and then I hand over to you, Susan. Just wastewater data from Ottawa. As you see here, I didn't even show the case counts anymore, but that's the association you see of wastewater signals with hospital occupancy, as you see here, which continues to work really well. And Ontario has a very well-established wastewater surveillance system. We're working on that right now in the background to make this visible for the province of Ontario. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Dr. Juni. That was excellent. We have so many questions, but we'll just start with one that went directly to me. Does Omicron not only outcompete Delta, but will it also displace Delta? Will all or almost all future infections be Omicron?
We don't know. To be honest with you, you would need to ask somebody else who is more knowledgeable about the exact mechanisms here. What I expect right now to happen is, because of the public health interventions just kicking in, together with just an increased immunity that we will be seeing either through Omicron or through first, second, and third doses, it will become more and more challenging for Delta, and it will probably just disappear with time because of this, or just a combination of these different factors. What was very odd is that at the very beginning, when Omicron was at 30 to 40%, that we really started to see case counts go down. That's not that we missed those, that was probably real. And I don't completely understand this mechanism. Is there something going on a molecular level or so that I wouldn't be able to understand? I simply don't know. What probably will happen right now is a combination of all the measures and vaccine, etc., that Delta will nearly disappear.
Great, thank you. Given the lower replication and self-fusion ability of Omicron, can we expect a lower incidence of long COVID compared to Delta?
Nobody knows right now. We haven't fully understood. Well, we haven't understood at all what the mechanisms will then eventually be for long COVID. I would assume that autoimmune phenomena and microvascular dysregulation play a relatively important role for long COVID, and we simply don't know what's happening here. What we know in general, of course, for SARS-CoV-2 is, until Omicron, it triggered a lot of autoimmune phenomena. Will this change fundamentally for Omicron? I don't know.
Okay, thanks. Do we know anything about the new antiviral medications and their effectiveness against Omicron?
They still have to work, and they still continue to work, yes. And so will one of the antibodies, sotrovimab, whereas the other antibodies don't anymore.
And can you tell us a little bit about back to school? Should we be concerned about children, many of who are under 12, only one vaccination, and Omicron?
Well, I think it's important that the challenges we see with children is mostly now in ages below the age of 5. So they're not yet in junior kindergarten. And this is probably what we're seeing now is more like an RSV kind of picture, clinical picture. My colleagues tell me, my colleagues from pediatrics, which makes quite some sense. That's for various reasons. I wouldn't be too concerned if we just, right now, what we know for schools is that the harms that we're doing by keeping schools closed are massive. So the combination of one and hopefully very soon 2 doses, I would get them vaccinated after 5 weeks after the first dose, just get the second dose. That's my personal view. That's not the recommendations out there yet. If they have had these 2 doses and they have masks, ventilation, cohorting, etc., why would it be much more unsafe in schools than at home? The only difference is perhaps lunch hour. Lunch hour is a headache, but I would send them to school. We will send ours.
Great, thanks. We're actually at time, but do I have your permission to carry on for another 10 minutes or so? Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Fantastic, thank you. There was a question on the news media on what to do about a booster dose after having COVID. And the response was, if you have Delta, do this, and if you have Omicron, do that. Are there PCR tests that differentiate between the two? 3 primer mismatch. I'm not sure what that means. I have not seen details.
So look, first of all, it's not a big deal. If you want to have a luxury problem, you start to think about when to have the booster after infection. If you want to optimize it based on the theoretical considerations and lab data, it's probably okay to wait 6 to 8 weeks, then you will have the optimal immune response. Does it matter if it's earlier than that? Probably not that much. So I wouldn't worry too much. If you want to optimize it, you're protected anyway after Omicron and Delta. Wait for 6 to 8 weeks. If you never had a positive rapid or PCR test, so you're not quite sure whether it was indeed COVID or not, just get the booster and get it over with.
Thanks. Very helpful, as I have children who are vaccinated and with COVID at the moment. So that's very helpful. Any information on when to vaccinate and booster after isolation and no longer symptomatic? Is that what you just answered?
Yeah, it's in a way, it's the same story. It's really just, the point is just once you have an exposition with the virus or with a vaccine, your immune response can become more mature, more pronounced and wider. And this happens 6 to 8 weeks after the last exposition. That's the reason why people suggest to wait sometimes.
Okay, great. I have permission to the next one. The distribution of existing immunity in Canada, and in particular the immune and naive, is very likely very different than South
Absolutely.
America, UK, and others. Do we have any data or modeling yet on severity in immune naive and their contribution to ICU?
Yes, so indeed, that's what I tried to make. So right now, based on analysis from Ontario, we don't have much evidence to suggest that the relative risk is different in the vaccinated or the unvaccinated. We struggle a bit, to understand precisely those with previous infections because we underdetect those also in Ontario. But right now, the best bet is to assume this decrease by a factor of 2 of hospital admissions and by a factor of 4 to 5 for ICU admissions, also for both vaccinated and unvaccinated. But of course, the unvaccinated have a 5 to 10-fold increased risk up front.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
The unvaccinated, I'm not sure whether I said it right. The unvaccinated, the increased risk 5 to 10-fold, 5-fold for hospital admissions, to 8-fold or so, and certainly 10 to 20-fold for ICU admissions.
Thank you. Based on the 7-day doubling hospitalization projections noted on slide 21 and any completed modeling of Omicron, when can we expect hospital admissions related to Omicron to peak in Ontario?
Yeah, I would like to know that too. We're currently trying to triangulate all of that. It's really quite challenging right now because the testing system is overwhelmed and because of the changing testing strategy. So tonight my night will be dedicated to wastewater analysis. I just received the full data set. And we're currently looking into that. It's relatively safe to assume that we will see some changes relatively soon, within a week to 10 days, but I don't know how much yet, because of the really pronounced change in out-of-home mobility of people. So people in Ontario really react in a really, really great way. This will be helpful. If in the absence of any impact there, it's relatively safe to assume that somewhere in the second half of January, we will start to see imaginary or hypothetical case numbers peak, followed perhaps about 7 days later by hospital occupancy. And then again, another 7 days later, ICU occupancy.
And that moves nicely into the next question about, are we closer to being in an endemic situation? How long might it take for us and the rest of the world to agree we're in an endemic phase?
Yes, so the big game changer from my perspective is indeed the moment when nearly everybody will have had some sort of immunity through vaccination, through infection, or a combination of the two. This all helps tremendously. The vulnerabilities we have as a population is of course, the unvaccinated and the uninfected first and foremost. And then, of course, people who are a priori vulnerable because of their age or other pronounced risk factors. So it's a combination. Once we achieve that nearly everybody who hasn't seen a vaccine yet actually has some immunity, things are bound to get better. If there's not another curveball that nobody sees coming. I didn't see Omicron coming, to be honest, but I would believe it would still actually just change things quite considerably. I can't guarantee endemicity relatively soon, but I can guarantee that we can move much closer to endemicity after the Omicron wave.
Great, thanks. And a few questions back and forth here and comments about testing. Can you just talk a little bit more about the throat versus the nasal testing? And then also just clarify the false negatives for Omicron.
Okay, so first with the testing, there is, for instance, a study, an analysis from Michael Garron that looked into that relatively well. Janine McCready would be one of the co-authors, and Alison McGeer, if you want to look for this. I think it's published meanwhile in a peer-reviewed journal. So just use buccal, tongue, and then nasal, anterior nasal as a combination. This could be a good start, but to be honest with you, we don't have yet good data on that. But if I wanted to do a rapid test early on, I would probably try that, but we would need to validate that. That's as good as it gets. It's probably better than just nasal based on a jigsaw of evidence. The problem is really early on, we just have a lot of false negatives. I would assume it's about, right now, the sensitivity is only about 50% early on. So we have two things that complicate rapid tests if you do it nasal at least. One is the low sensitivity, and the other one is the really high pretest probability, because there are so many people. It's probably 10% of the population right now that is infectious right now, meaning your way of dealing with this early on and use a rapid test to rule out disease is null. Forget it, it's an illusion now. You can still rule in if a rapid test is positive, believe it. You don't need to have a confirmation anymore. And probably once you've reached the peak and or on the downward slope, all the data point towards that, then once a rapid test becomes negative and you're 5, 6, 7 days after your onset of symptoms, you're just cool and you're probably clear and are not infectious anymore, not that much infectious.
Thank you. What advice do you have for those saying that if Omicron symptoms are mild, they want to try to get Omicron to gain immunity?
Yeah, that's not a really good idea, because right now, if you just hit the jackpot and end up in the hospital, despite your vaccine that you have, or on an ICU, you will get suboptimal care. We run out of drugs. We don't have yet the antivirals. We don't have enough antibodies. We don't have enough tocilizumab. We only have dexamethasone, heparin, and perhaps fluvoxamine. That's all we have right now. So you don't want to do that. It's just the wrong time.
And what about the pattern to come? If it's seasonal, since the virus is here to stay, should we expect a rapid increase in cases every fall following a public panic and lockdowns every year? What do you foresee?
So again, I think the big change will be that everybody after the Omicron wave, or nearly everybody, statistically speaking, I don't know yet where we will end up, 95% of the population, 97, 99, somewhere there will have had some immunity through infection and vaccination or both. No? And this will change things. Remember, the cellular immunity will still hold relatively robustly, I would believe. And of course, there will be updates of the vaccine, and I would believe that we will have an update in autumn or so that takes into account the currently existing variant. Fingers crossed it's still Omicron and nothing else. And then there's the other part, what do we need in addition to restrictions? I would assume in certain situations, masks or so would need to continue for a few years, but we'll see how it goes. But I would not expect that we need to go back to restrictions as we see right now. But of course, I could have egg on my face and be wrong. I don't think this will be the case.
Thank you. I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll have to stop. Sorry about that, everyone, because there's lots of great questions here. Can you tell us a little bit about the recommendations for boosters for teens in high school, for instance, that had their vaccination in the summer of 2021? What about boosters for this age group?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't see a problem with that eventually. That's my personal view. But of course, it will depend then on Health Canada and NACI as well. The point here is really that when people have had 2 doses at that age, their risk is probably really quite low, to end up in a challenging situation. So I wouldn't be overly concerned once they have had 2 doses, but it's probably coming.
And not to end on a dark note, but what do you think about the probability of another variant around the corner?
Oh, we don't know. The point really is this virus has proven to be tremendously smart from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, what we saw was just evolution in real time. I mean, this thing, if it weren't so tragic, it would actually be really beautiful to watch what's happening. It's remarkable. You remember these curves of replacement, up, down, up, down. Whether there's anything coming, I said that last time, it's very difficult to outcompete Delta, and here Omicron was. Is there anything coming that could outcompete Omicron? I can't rule that out, of course, but what I can say is once we all received some sort of immunity through infection or vaccination, things should become better.
Great. And actually, I will squeeze one more in about the under 5s. Can you talk a little bit about their plight and what could be in store for them?
So right now, it's probably this virus now, this variant has much more affinity to the upper respiratory tract, but it also has probably different ways of latching to cells than just what we were accustomed to with previous variants. And the combination of the two now means that children who have a lower density of ACE2, if they're small, don't have the advantage anymore that they had with previous variants. And in addition, the virus seems to behave much more like RSV, meaning children with smaller bronchi might have a bit more of a challenge. And we might see that the advantage that kids had before just disappears. It's not more severe in kids than in young adults, but perhaps it's not less severe anymore. And now it's a numbers game that we just see quite a lot of children.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Juni. This has been terrific. Thanks for your wisdom and your insights on this. There's been a question here about whether or not you could share your slides. We do share the recording online after the talk here today.
Yeah, and I can also share the slides. Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. Terrific. Just a couple of announcements. Next week, we do have another speaker series. The topic is just being finalized now. It'll be 3 o'clock next week. And then the following week, on the following Tuesday, we have a session on homelessness and COVID. And a reminder, Rosa can pop that in the chat there again to please give us some feedback. And we have a short and sweet evaluation for you. And also to come, there'll be a notice about this soon on January 24th at 12:30 in partnership with CITF. We'll have a session on waning immunity. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks again, and thanks to the home team. Yep.
We would like to thank our speakers and members of our network for their continued support and participation in Canada's pandemic response. If you are interested in learning more about CanCovid or joining our Pan-Canadian COVID-19 Research Network, please visit our website at www.cancovid.ca.